My name is Alex, I'm 38 years old, and I've always considered my life to be fairly happy and stable. I worked for a large company, my wife Alice and I had our own home and a beautiful daughter. I sincerely believed that we had created a perfect life together. For all the 12 years we were married, I never even thought that there could be any distrust or doubt between us. Alice has always been my rock, my support and my love. But lately, I started to notice changes that have been bothering me. It all started a few months ago when Alice started acting a little strange. Normally, she was always very open, we both often left our phones out in the open and never had any reason to hide anything from each other. But suddenly, she started taking her phone with her more often, even to the bathroom, even though she had never done that before. She became somehow alienated, closed off, and I couldn't understand what could have changed her behavior so suddenly. At first I thought it might be stress at work or some personal problems. I tried not to pay attention to it and thought that everything would fall into place over time. However, every day my anxiety grew, and I started to catch myself thinking that something was wrong with our relationship. One night, when I got home a little earlier than usual, I saw her quickly close her phone screen as if she was trying to hide something. It was the first time I felt a real stab of jealousy. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what was going on. Every doubt that had seemed silly and insignificant before now seemed so obvious that I could no longer ignore it. I stayed up almost all night trying to remember everything that could have caused such a change in her behavior. Was there something I hadn't seen? Maybe we had problems that I just didn't notice? But it was all in vain. I couldn't find answers to these questions. The next morning, when Alice left for work, I felt a strong urge to check her things. I knew it was wrong, but my suspicion was growing, and I just couldn't give up this impulse. In her bag, I found something strange, a small piece of paper, crumpled and hidden between other personal items. My hand trembled as I unfolded it. The paper read, "I can't wait for our next meeting." These words made me break out in a cold sweat. Word by word, line by line, I reread this short inscription, trying to find some reasonable reason why it was in my wife's bag. I wanted to convince myself that it was some kind of harmless joke, something frivolous, but these words left no room for ambiguity. I realized that this piece of paper was not just an accident. All day long I tried to behave as usual, but the same thoughts kept swarming in my head. Every time I thought about that piece of paper, my heart would clench. In the evening, when I got home, I decided to talk to Alice and find out what was going on. I tried to find the words to start the conversation so as not to scare her and create even more distance between us. When she turned around, I looked at her and saw her avoiding my gaze. It was a strange feeling, as if we had become strangers who barely spoke to each other. At dinner, I gathered my courage and asked her directly, "Alice, is something wrong? You seem distant lately, and I think something has changed between us. If we have a problem, I want to know about it." She looked at me a little surprised, but quickly smiled and said it was just my imagination. "Alex, you're worrying too much." "I just have a lot of work to do, that's all," she replied, trying to keep calm. But her words didn't convince me, and that strange smile only made my suspicions worse. From then on, things only got worse. Every night she came home late, explaining it was because of work and busyness. But I couldn't shake the thought that she was hiding something. I couldn't concentrate on my business, my mind was completely occupied with thoughts that Alice was no longer honest with me. I was growing afraid that what I had seen on that piece of paper was just the tip of the iceberg. After that conversation with Alice, I realized that I needed more evidence to see for myself if there was any basis for my suspicions. I decided that I could no longer sit back and wait for things to work themselves out. At times, my thoughts became too obsessive, and I started to notice details that I might not have noticed before. One night she stayed late at work again, and I sat in the kitchen, staring into the void and wondering what to do next. One of those evenings, I decided to go into her office. At first, I felt like I was doing something wrong, but my doubts eclipsed that voice. I opened her laptop, which she usually didn't hide, and started looking through her emails and chats. everything looked quite normal until I came across a conversation with a colleague whose name I had never heard before, Mark. There was nothing explicit in the correspondence, but I could feel a certain affection. These were ordinary questions. How was your day? What are you planning for the weekend? But my intuition told me that something was wrong. Mark was just a coworker who was supposedly helping her with a project, but more and more messages from him seemed too friendly. I had a feeling of jealousy that I tried to suppress, but it was hard. Everything I found only added to my suspicions, and I could feel the anger building inside me. I wanted to ask her about Mark, but I realized that I had no direct evidence, only my doubts. So I decided to wait and follow up. A few days passed. One morning when she left for work, I decided to check her car. Everything was in its place, but when I leaned over to the seat, I saw a small piece of paper that looked a little crumpled. I carefully picked it up and unfolded it. It was a bill from a restaurant I'd never heard of, and the dates on it matched the nights Alice had worked late. My heart stopped for a moment, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I began to feel like the hero of a detective story, uncovering a conspiracy. This account was the first hard evidence that something was really going on behind my back. But was it something more than just dinner? Maybe it was an innocent date with a colleague? But if it was so innocent, why didn't she tell me about it? One question after another rang in my head, and each one hit the walls of my mind, leaving painful marks. In order not to give away my suspicions, I decided that I would act as if nothing had happened. In the evening, when she came home, I tried to be the man she was used to. I saw her avoiding my gaze, as if she could feel my inner torment. It was a strange situation. We were sitting together, but the feeling of intimacy was gone, as if an invisible wall had been built between us. I asked her how her day had been, and she answered with standard phrases, but her eyes kept looking away. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay next to her, listening to her steady breathing, trying to understand what I was feeling. My heart was breaking with pain, and my head was full of thoughts. On the one hand, I was afraid to find out the truth, but on the other hand, I couldn't live in uncertainty anymore. I decided that in the morning I would contact my friend Jake, who worked in the security service, and ask for his advice. I needed more information, more evidence, to understand what was really going on. The next day I met with Jake, we had a cup of coffee, and I told him about my suspicions. He listened intently without interrupting, and when I finished, he just nodded his head and said he understood. Jake offered me some simple ways to keep an eye on her, advising me on how I could gather more information without arousing Alice's suspicions. He gave me some tips on how to follow her without being noticed, using technical devices that could help me understand what she was doing in her free time. I felt guilty for taking such steps, but my inner sense of betrayal did not allow me to stop. I bought a small GPS tracker that could be discreetly attached to her car and installed it the next day when Alice was busy with other things. Now I could know her whereabouts at any given moment. Although this was not concrete proof of her infidelity, I felt that I was getting closer to the truth with each step. Over the next few days, I followed her. I noticed that she frequented the same restaurant I had found the bill from. And every time she came home after these dinners, she was a completely different person, silent, distant, and strangely content. These were signs that I could no longer ignore. She was living a double life, and as painful as it sounded, I realized that it was time to find out the truth, leaving no room for doubt. A few weeks had passed since I started following Alice. And although I already had enough evidence that something was wrong between us, I wasn't ready to make a frank confession. I kept all these suspicions inside, like a heavy stone that I couldn't let go of. I hoped that maybe it was all just my fantasies, that I was too suspicious, and that one day Alice would come to me and tell me about all her problems. But instead, I received a bitter truth that broke me. It happened one Sunday evening when we were sitting at home after dinner. My daughter had already gone to bed, and it was just the two of us watching TV. I was watching Alice, trying to figure out if there was anything I could ask without arousing too much suspicion. She was quiet, lost in thought, and suddenly, as if she sensed my gaze, she put down the remote and turned to me. "We need to talk, Alex," she said, and I felt as if something had broken in my chest. These were the words I was most afraid to hear. About what? I asked calmly, although my insides were boiling with tension. I tried to keep my tone even and not show how much this conversation was scaring me. I don't know where to start, she began, sighing heavily. You should know that I love you very much, and I'm grateful for everything you do for me. But... Her voice trembled, and she stumbled, unable to find the right words. I sat still, waiting to hear what she would say next, even though I could feel my mind going black. Ordinary words that used to bring me joy now seemed empty and meaningless. But what, Alice? My voice sounded cold, as if it belonged to someone else. I met someone who made me think about our relationship, she said, and I felt her words echo in my head. It pains me to say this, but I think I need more freedom. I don't think I feel completely happy. I just stared at her, not believing my ears. It was impossible. Everything I felt, everything I thought about our marriage suddenly lost its meaning. I was paralyzed, not knowing how to react to her confession. My head was spinning with questions. Who is this man? Why did she decide to seek happiness on the side? And most importantly, what had I done wrong to make it come to this? Are you serious? I said with difficulty, trying not to show all the pain that was raging inside. Alice nodded, looking down. Yes, Alex. I'm not saying I want to leave you or get a divorce. It's just... I feel like I'm lost in myself. And I don't want to lie to you, so I decided to tell you the truth. Her words were like a punch in the stomach. Instead of feeling anger or hatred, I felt only emptiness. My life was falling apart right in front of me, and I didn't know how to deal with it. All I could do was sit there and look at her, trying to understand when it all went wrong. What do you think you're going to do? I asked, barely able to control my voice. I didn't want to yell or blame her, even though every cell in my body was screaming at me for betraying her. I don't know, she replied. I just feel like I have to go through this to figure out what I really want. I want to be honest with you and feel like I'm free to make my own choices. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Alice, my wife, the woman I considered my everything, wanted to have an affair because she felt she needed freedom. It was so absurd and painful that I could barely find the words. And how do you envision our relationship after that? I asked, trying to understand her logic. Do you think I'm just going to go along with this and sit at home while you enjoy life with someone else? Alice looked at me with pain in her eyes. Alex, I don't know how to make this work. I just know that I need this experience. Maybe it will help me realize what I really want. These words made me break out in a cold sweat. My love for her was boundless, but how could I agree to this situation? How could I let her leave, knowing that she would come back filled with emotions for another man? There was only one word in my head: betrayal. I realized that this was not just a violation of trust, it was a broken heart that could not be glued back together. I can't understand how you can talk about this so calmly, I said, feeling my voice tremble with emotion. You have no idea how much this hurts me. Alice pressed her lips together and looked at me with an expression of pain that seemed genuine. Alex, I didn't mean for this to happen. I just can't do otherwise. I thought about it for a long time and decided that I have to be honest with you, even if it's hard. My heart was broken. Sitting in front of me, she was silently asking me to understand her, to forgive her, and to let her make the choice she thought was right for her. But I didn't know if I could ever accept what she wanted to do. Alice's words echoed in my head like a relentless echo. She was sitting in front of me as if nothing special had happened, as if what she was saying was completely normal. I felt an invisible gap growing between us that we could not bridge. It wasn't just a conversation, it was a confession that was driving us further apart with every passing second. Alice, do you realize that this is unacceptable to me? I asked quietly, trying to remain calm, although everything was boiling inside me. Are you trying to destroy our marriage? She looked at me and sighed, as if she realized that the answer would not be easy. I don't want to ruin our marriage, Alex. I just want to understand myself. I want to know if I can find happiness outside of our relationship and still keep our family together. It may sound crazy, but I think I can make it work." Her words echoed with coldness in her chest. It was so incomprehensible that I could barely contain my anger. "Combine? You mean you're going to live a double life and still be my wife?" "That's just absurd." My voice rose, and I felt myself losing control. Alice calmly, as if she had already decided for herself, looked away. "It's hard for me to explain, but I don't want to lose you, Alex. You are an important part of my life, and I know that our marriage is valuable to both of us. There are just other things I need to explore." I was shocked by what she said. It sounded so selfish, like she was putting herself first without considering my feelings. "Have you thought about how I feel? How it will be for me?" I asked, looking into her eyes, trying to find at least a shadow of compassion in them. But she just looked away, and it made my pain even worse. "I understand that it hurts," she said quietly, lowering her head. "But if you really love me, you'll be able to understand that this is what I need." I stared at her, feeling despair rising in me. My love for her was enormous, but now I couldn't understand how it was possible to love someone so much and at the same time destroy their life. How could she talk about her feelings so easily without thinking about the consequences? "I don't know if I can understand that, Alice," I replied, barely holding back my tears. "What you're saying sounds like a betrayal, even if you don't think of it as such. You're willing to give up everything we have for some phantom feeling?" She was silent, just sitting in front of me, staring at the floor, as if trying to find answers to her own questions. She didn't cry, didn't pretend to be sorry, she just looked at the floor and listened to me. This made me realize that maybe she had already made her decision and my words would not change anything. "You don't even realize what you're doing, do you?" I said with bitterness in my voice. "You think this is just an experiment, that you can come back to me as if nothing had happened. But it's not that simple, Alice. I can't just sit back and watch you build a life with someone else, pretending that everything is fine between us." "I don't want you to feel abandoned," she replied, as if trying to reassure me. "I'm just looking for a way to find harmony in my life. I don't think this should be the end of our marriage." These words made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. Her attempts to justify her intentions seemed like a poorly thought-out plan that didn't seem to take me and my feelings into account at all. She talked about harmony, but what about my peace of mind? What about our child? Her harmony was too expensive. Harmony? Alice, this is not harmony, this is a breakup. You want to destroy us to explore some of your feelings, but you don't think about the consequences. My words became sharp as blades, and I could see them piercing her, but even that didn't make her flinch. "I just want to be honest with you, Alex." Her voice became fragile, as if she suddenly realized that she had already gone too far. "I can't hide behind lies anymore. I have to be real to you and to myself." As I sat there looking at her, I realized that our paths were diverging. What she was saying left no room for compromise. She had chosen her path, and I had to choose mine. "If you want to be honest, then you have to accept the consequences," I replied, feeling the last vestiges of warmth in our relationship dissolve into thin air. "But remember, Alice, there's no going back after this. You can't come back and say you want it all back when you realize you made a mistake." "I don't think it's a mistake," she replied quietly, and her eyes lit up with a strange determination I'd never seen before. It was the last straw. I stood up, feeling the pain and anger overwhelm me. "Well, Alice, you've made your choice," I said coldly, looking at her. "Now I'm going to make mine." She watched me as if she didn't understand what was happening. But everything became clear to me. There was no more us, no more family I was building. There was only a person who had chosen his own path, ignoring everything we had. "By the time you realize that this was stupid, it will be too late," I said finally, leaving the room. I could hear her silence behind me, but I didn't even look back. It was the beginning of the end, and I no longer had the strength to try to fix anything. The next few days were like a nightmare. Alice walked around the house, silent and distant, and I felt like our life was falling apart more and more every day. Every time we made eye contact, there was an awkward silence between us, which only made the bitterness worse. I could no longer look at her as my wife. She had chosen a different path, and that path did not include me. One evening, when I came home from work, I saw her sitting on the couch with a laptop on her lap. She didn't look in my direction, didn't say a word, she just kept staring at the screen as if I didn't exist. It was too much. I felt that I couldn't stand this state between us any longer, so I decided to act. "Alice, we can't continue to live in this atmosphere," I said quietly, standing in front of her. "We either figure this out now, or we end it completely." She looked up at me with some vague sadness in her eyes, but at the same moment she quickly looked down, as if she didn't want to show her true emotions. "What do you want me to say, Alex? We've already discussed everything. I just want to be myself, to understand my feelings." "Be yourself? Does that mean distancing yourself from me and our family?" My patience was running out. "Do you really think that's the solution?" "I don't know what's right," she replied, finally looking up. "I don't want to ruin anything, but at the same time I can't live any more feeling shackled." Her words were like a knife in the heart. She wanted freedom, but what was the price of that freedom for me? For our family? I tried to remain patient, not wanting to raise my voice, but everything inside me was burning. "You talk about freedom, but why is it so hard for you to let me go? If you want to live your own life, maybe we should really break up." I decided to say the words I had been wanting to say for a long time. She flinched in surprise and looked at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. "Break up? I never said I wanted to do that, Alex. I love you. I don't know how else to organize my life." "That's not love, Alice. Love isn't supposed to hurt that much," I replied, trying to stay firm. "If you really loved me, you wouldn't have chosen a different path that destroys us." Alice fell silent, and we found ourselves back in the same silence that seemed to have become our norm. I had nothing more to say. I realized that I could not convince her, no matter what I said. She had chosen her path, and I had no choice but to choose mine. "I think you have to go to him," I finally said, feeling pain mixing with anger. "Then you'll realize what you're missing." "It's not that simple, Alex," she began, but I interrupted her. "Not easy? What did you think? That I would just agree with your decision and live as if nothing had happened? That I would agree to you having another man while I'm here waiting for you? That's ridiculous, Alice, and you know it." The anger I had been holding back for a long time burst out. She remained silent, but I could see her eyes filling with tears. I didn't want to hurt her, but I couldn't keep quiet any longer. Her decision broke me, and I couldn't pretend that everything would be okay anymore. "Alex, please don't make a drama out of this," she said quietly, wiping away her tears. "We can find a way out if we are open with each other." "Open?" I couldn't believe my ears. "You talk about openness, but you hide everything that is important to you from me. This is not openness, this is selfishness." There was a long pause after these words. We both sat in the room, staring at the floor in silence, as if trying to find answers to questions that had long since ceased to matter. I realized that our relationship had finally changed, and there was no going back. After a few minutes, she got up without saying anything and left the room. I was left alone, feeling empty and broken. It felt like everything I loved, everything I believed in, was gone. I sat in silence, trying to accept the new reality, but it seemed unbearable. The next day I made the final decision. I contacted a lawyer and made an appointment to start the divorce process. Maybe it was an impulse, maybe I just couldn't take the pain she was causing me anymore. But I knew one thing: we could no longer be together. When Alice found out about my decision, she was shocked. "Are you really ready to end it?" she asked, looking at me with eyes full of tears. "You gave me a choice?" I replied with a pain that had become almost a part of me. "You made this decision yourself when you decided that our relationship was not important enough for you." She tried to say something, to justify herself, but I was no longer listening. Our marriage was over. What we once had was gone, and there was no point in trying to salvage the wreckage anymore. I got up and left, leaving her to face her own decisions and consequences. The divorce happened so quickly that I didn't even have time to recover. We signed all the necessary documents, discussed who would keep what things, and parted ways without saying a word. All these days after the divorce, it seemed like life had lost its meaning. I tried to keep my dignity, to behave calmly, but a real storm was raging inside me. Alice left the house immediately after the divorce, taking nothing with her but a suitcase of clothes. She left with her head held high, as if what had happened was a victory for her. It just tore me up. Every time I thought about her face, about that cold look, I felt everything inside shrink. I loved her no matter what. But now this love turned into a thirst for revenge. The first days after her departure, I tried to find peace by immersing myself in my work, but thoughts of Alice would not leave me alone. I knew that she was somewhere with another man, perhaps sitting with him in a cozy restaurant or spending her evenings in his arms. These thoughts filled me with anger. Sometimes I just couldn't stand it and went to a bar, where I drank one drink after another, trying to drown out the pain. One evening, as I sat at the bar staring at my empty glass, a thought came to me that was nagging at me. Why should I just sit there and let her abuse me? Why do I have to endure this humiliation? I knew I couldn't win her back, and maybe I didn't want to, but there was something else I could do: collect evidence of her betrayal and find a way to get back at her lover, the man who made everything fall apart. When I got home that night, I started thinking about my plan. I realized that I had to be careful not to let her realize that I was following her. I decided to start with the easiest thing to do: find out where she was living now and what her new life looked like. I knew I had a few tools to help me with this, and I started by installing a tracker on her car that I had left in her old set of keys before the divorce. The tracker allowed me to get the first answers to my questions. Over the next week, I checked her movements regularly. She rarely stayed at home in the evenings, but rather visited various establishments, cafes and restaurants, and each time her route ended at the same place. It was a small house on the outskirts of the city where she spent the night. I concluded that this was where her lover lived. This place became an object of observation for me. The next evening, when she went there again, I decided to follow her personally. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, but the desire to see everything with my own eyes was stronger than I was. I parked near the house, turned off the car lights, and waited. My heart was pounding with anticipation and excitement, and at the same time I felt anger and alcohol mixing in my blood, prompting me to take rash actions. About an hour passed, and I saw Alice leave the house with her husband. I tensed, looking at him from a distance. He looked older than me, tall, slightly graying, but obviously happy with life. They got into the car and drove toward the restaurant. I followed them, keeping a safe distance. Everything was boiling inside me, and I felt that this was just the beginning of my revenge. When they got out of the car and headed for the restaurant, I stayed waiting nearby. Every minute seemed like an eternity, but I couldn't just leave. I needed more information. I started thinking about how best to collect evidence that would give me more control over the situation. In the end, I decided to take advantage of the opportunity offered by modern technology. The next day I bought some small listening devices and installed one in her car. Now I could hear all her conversations and learn more about her relationship. Every new detail I learned only strengthened my desire to get even with this man who took my wife away from me. However, unexpectedly, I learned something strange. In one of our conversations, Alice mentioned another man she was planning to meet. It was someone I did not know and whom she had never mentioned. This new information made me wonder. Had she not only betrayed me with one man, but was she living a double, even triple life? My rage grew with each conversation I heard, each new confirmation of her betrayal. I decided that I would not stop until I had all the evidence of her double life and found a way to make her and her lovers pay for the pain they had caused. But at the same time as my rage, a wave of hopelessness washed over me. I realized that my life was ruined, that I had lost everything I had. Every night I would come home and open a bottle of whiskey, hoping to find peace for at least a few hours. As the alcohol began to cloud my consciousness, I had thoughts that seemed unattainable during the day. I imagined making each of them answer for their betrayal. But the next morning, when I woke up with a headache and a bitter taste in my mouth, I realized that these were just fantasies and returned to reality. My plan was simple. I was going to collect all the evidence I could and expose her to the public. I wanted everyone to know who Alice really is. It was important for me to show that I would not allow her to despise me and our family. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside me. I was becoming more violent, more indifferent, and ready to go to extreme lengths to get my revenge. My obsession with following Alice only grew. Every time I found out something new, a new wave of anger and pain would ignite in me. I no longer knew where I ended and where the desire for revenge began. All my thoughts were focused on one thing: to find out every detail of her new life and to understand what had become of the woman I once loved. I decided to go further, so I installed another GPS tracker in her new home, which I had already learned she did not live alone. I wanted to get as much information as possible to uncover the truth about her life. This tracker showed me her movements to the minute, which allowed me to better understand her schedule. I became like a hunter waiting for the right moment to strike. A few days later, I noticed that she often met with another man besides the first. They didn't come to her house at the same time, but they often visited the same places: a restaurant, a park where they walked together, and a hotel on the outskirts of the city. My suspicion was confirmed: Alice had more than one lover. I had a terrible feeling as soon as I thought about it. Each new fact was like a stab in the back. To collect more evidence, I decided to use cameras. I bought 2 small portable cameras that I could hide in her house. The next time she went to see her first lover, I went to her house and set up the cameras in places where they could record her meetings. Now I had the opportunity to see everything with my own eyes. The days dragged on slowly. I watched the recorded video, watching Alice meet with one man and then another. She was friendly, cheerful, and carefree, as if her whole life had been rebuilt. These images cut my eyes and made me clench my teeth in rage. I no longer recognized the woman with whom I had once shared my life. Out of pain and disappointment, I took a bottle of whiskey every night, trying to drown out this burning feeling of betrayal. But alcohol only intensified my thoughts and deepened my pain. I would sit in the dark, staring at the screen showing a happy Alice with strange men, and feel completely broken. Every time the alcohol finally got the better of my body, I would fall asleep right in the chair, and in the morning I would wake up with a heavy head, an even worse mood, and an unbearable desire to act. One day I heard Alice on a recording talking to her new lover. Her voice was full of tenderness, which I hadn't heard from her for a long time. She was talking about their plans for the future, and it stunned me. How could she forget about us so quickly? About everything we had together? I realized that she hadn't just found someone on the side, she had started building a new life in which there was no place for me. I decided that this time I would not limit myself to gathering information. I wanted to strike a blow, to make her feel what I was going through. So I started following her new lovers. I found out where they worked, where they lived, and what they did in their free time. I carefully researched each of them to find the slightest weaknesses, and now I had all the information I needed. I had a plan: first I would destroy her reputation, and then I would take on each of her lovers. I wasn't going to stop until I made sure they paid for everything that had happened. I even imagined each of them being trapped in the same way I was. They will also feel betrayed, they will also understand what it is like to be used. But along with the rage, another feeling was brewing inside me: an unbearable sense of loneliness. Despite all my determination, I realized that I missed Alice. Sometimes I thought I would never be able to forget her, even though she had caused me the most pain in my life. In those moments, alcohol was my only friend, helping me to drown out the memories. The day was approaching when I was going to strike the first blow. I had already developed a plan and knew how it was going to happen. My anger and rage were to become a tool for revenge. But at the same time, somewhere deep inside, I felt doubtful. would it really bring me peace, or would it make me even more broken? That evening, sitting with another glass of whiskey in the dark room, I stared at my computer screen for a long time, where the camera footage flickered. It seemed that my whole life had now been reduced to these few images: her, happy, in the company of strangers, and me, alone, in the dark, drunk and lost. I didn't know if revenge would help cure me, but I couldn't stop. In the morning I woke up with a new purpose. Today I had to take the first step towards my revenge. I went through all the records, prepared evidence, and made a detailed plan on how to use it. I knew it was only the beginning, but it was a step I could no longer postpone. The next few days became a battlefield for me, where I could finally implement my revenge plan. I started acting gradually, taking my time, so that Alice wouldn't feel that something was wrong. First, I sent an anonymous letter to her first lover, hinting that he was not the only man in her life. It was only the first step, but his reaction piqued my interest. Over the course of a few days, I watched the man begin to show jealousy, and his relationship with Alice became more tense. They often fought, and it was evident even in her mood. She would come home more nervous, and there was an anxiety in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. I felt like I was winning. For the first time in a long time, I had a sense of control over the situation. But I didn't stop there. I prepared several more anonymous letters, hinting at her other relationships, describing everything as if someone close to her knew. Each time, I wrote the letter in a different style so that she could not guess that one person was behind it. I wanted her to feel as confused and broken as I did. After a while, I started to notice that she became more distant even with her second lover. It was a man from a neighboring town with whom she used to spend weekends, but now their meetings started to happen less and less. Every time I watched the camera footage I had left at her house, I saw her sitting alone, staring at a blank screen, as if searching for answers to her questions. This surprised me. It seemed that my revenge was working. However, another feeling was growing inside me: loneliness and devastation. Revenge did not bring me the satisfaction I expected. I was ready for triumph, but I felt only bitterness. Every night I would come home, open a bottle and drink, trying to find salvation in it. But alcohol only made this vacuum worse, filling it with dim thoughts and memories. One evening, already drunk and devastated, I watched the videos again. It became my ritual. As soon as I was overwhelmed with emotions, would turn on the cameras and watch what was happening in her life. But this time, instead of feeling revenge, I saw something else. In her eyes was the same loneliness I felt. She was sitting in the room with her head in her hands, and it looked like her face was crying. My heart was clenched. Was she really happy in her new life? I could see her relationship crumbling, just like ours. It seemed that my revenge was beginning to destroy her from the inside, but at the same time I did not feel joy. It became clear to me that my anger, my thirst for revenge, was only making the situation worse, not better. I was overcome with the feeling that I had gone too far. I couldn't turn back the clock, but I didn't want to continue either. I had spent my whole life destroying the person I once loved, but now I couldn't find any sense in it myself. I remembered the words of my friend Jake: "Revenge only feeds your wounds, not heals them." Perhaps I had indeed held on to the pain for too long. That night, sitting in the dark room, I decided it was time to end it. I gathered all the records, all the evidence, and hid them away. I realized that I didn't want to keep them around anymore. They only reminded me of the pain I was trying to forget. I decided to stop following Alice and give her the peace she probably needed. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy head, but I felt a sense of freedom inside. It was the first time in a long time that I didn't feel the urge to look for new ways to take revenge. I decided to start my life from scratch and focus on my own happiness. It wasn't easy. The pain of the betrayal was still there, but I realized that continuing this pointless pursuit was a futile exercise. In the evening, I went to the bar where I had once started my journey to revenge, but this time not to drown out the pain. I sat there sipping a single glass of whiskey and realized that it was time to move on. Revenge didn't bring me peace, and the only way to recover was to forget about Alice and start building a new life. My story with her was over, and although it left a deep scar, I was ready to move on. From now on, I promised myself not to look back and not to let the past poison my future. I could no longer contain my anger. My desire for revenge became almost uncontrollable. All those nights I spent watching Alice and collecting evidence had now been put to use. All this time I had been keeping it like a weapon, waiting for the moment when I could strike her the worst. And that moment has come. The first thing I did was to meet with the wives of her lovers. I found their contact information and sent each of them all the recordings, photos, and messages I had collected. My goal was simple: I wanted them to see the truth, to understand who their other half really was. I knew that this would be a huge blow to Alice, because now her secret life would be known not only to me. The reaction was immediate. Both women reacted exactly as I expected. They immediately contacted their husbands and the real drama began. I watched it with satisfaction, knowing that I had hit the nail on the head. Alice could no longer hide behind her lies. Her lovers began to avoid her, one by one turning away. She was left all alone, destroyed and betrayed, just as I was once broken by her betrayal. But even after that, the feeling of satisfaction was short-lived. I felt that it was not enough. My anger and pain remained inside, haunting me. I wanted more. I wanted her to suffer the way I had suffered. I took her wedding ring, which was left over from the divorce, and destroyed it. I smashed it, trampled on it, and burned it, watching this symbol of our relationship turn to ashes. Every night I would come home, open a bottle and drink, trying to drown out my pain. But alcohol only made the feeling of emptiness worse. At those moments, the darkest thoughts came to me. I realized that I had lost everything: love, hope, and the future. And at the same time, I felt that I could not leave her alone. My obsession continued to control me, forcing me to look for new ways to hurt her even more. One night, when the alcohol had completely clouded my mind, I had a terrible thought. I imagined what it would be like to take the lives of all those who had ruined my existence. Every time I thought about it, I was filled with fear and at the same time a kind of morbid pleasure. I could see how I could make them all pay for my suffering, how I could make their last moments a living hell. This thought haunted me. I imagined finding her lovers one by one, standing in front of them with cold determination. I was filled with rage, with the desire to punish them, to leave my mark on their lives the way they had left theirs on mine. I sat in the dark room, staring into the void and feeling my mind fill with this idea. But at the same time, I realized that it was only an illusion of control, a painful delusion caused by my condition and anger. I decided to stop for a moment, to step back, to think about whether I was really ready to take such extreme measures. But the idea was already planted in me, and I couldn't get rid of it. The following days passed in a fog of alcohol and hatred. I was more and more immersed in my plans, thinking over every step, every possible scenario. It no longer seemed like a crazy fantasy. On the contrary, I felt that I had a purpose, and that this path was the only one possible for me. My head was filled with images of how I would forever erase all evidence of her new life, how her lovers would realize the price of betrayal. I began to follow them more actively, studying their schedules, their daily habits. Every time I discovered a new detail, I felt a wave of satisfaction, which, however, quickly turned into rage. I could see them continuing their normal lives as if they had not caused me any pain, as if my presence was invisible to them. This made me even more determined to act. But every time I was ready to take a decisive step, I was overcome with doubt. All this time I had been acting in anger, in the name of revenge, but now I began to realize that this threatened not only them, but also myself. Was I ready to cross this line, beyond which there would be no return? But alcohol and the pain of betrayal pushed me to continue again and again. One evening, as I sat in my chair, looking at the bottle that stood empty in front of me, I realized that I had to make the final decision. At that moment, I felt such hatred for Alice and everyone who had ruined my life that I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the phone and called her, trying to keep my voice calm, even though everything was raging inside me. "Alice," I said when she answered the phone. She seemed startled by my call because I had never called her since our divorce. Her voice trembled when she answered, and that only made me more confident. "Alex. What do you want?" she asked, and I could feel her fear transmitting to me. "I want you to realize that everything comes at a price," I said coldly. "You have taken everything from me, and I will not let that go unanswered." She fell silent, not knowing what to say, and that inspired me even more. I heard her breathing on the other end of the phone, and it was music to my ears. She finally realized that I was serious, and that she shouldn't joke with me anymore. "Please, Alex. Don't do anything you'll regret," she finally said. I could hardly stop myself from telling her everything that was on my mind. "You should have thought about the consequences, not me," I said, coldly. "Now watch your life get ruined, just like you ruined mine." After that, I hung up the phone. Her trembling voice echoed in my head, but I didn't pay attention to it anymore. All these feelings were mixed in me, but they no longer mattered. Now I was a hostage to my own revenge, and I was ready to go all the way. The next day, I gathered all my notes, photos, and evidence and went to the office of her lover, whom she met most often. I went to his reception area and entered his office without waiting for permission. He looked up, surprised to see me, but I didn't give him a chance to speak. "These are pictures of you and Alice," I said, throwing them on the table. "I think your family will be happy to see how you're spending your time." His face paled and his eyes grew wide with fear. He tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. I was enjoying this moment, feeling like I was having real fun for the first time in a long time. He realized that his secret was out and that his life now depended on me. "But this is only the beginning," I added coldly. "You and everyone else will feel the same pain I felt." I left him sitting in the office, confused and scared, and stormed out. That day was a day of liberation for me, but I felt that something was still missing. My desire for revenge seemed insatiable, and I didn't know if I would ever be able to stop. After I left her lover's office, I was overcome with a feeling of incredible relief mixed with a strange emptiness. It was as if I had achieved what I wanted, but inside I felt no triumph or joy, only darkness that filled every cell of my body. I continued to destroy her life, step by step. I handed over all the evidence I had gathered to the families of her lovers, exposing their betrayal so that they could never return to their normal lives. I saw how their loved ones turned away from them, how their families were destroyed. My revenge was almost complete, but instead of satisfaction, I felt only a growing emptiness. Alice started calling me, begging me to meet her, trying to make excuses, but I didn't answer. Every message or call she sent only made me more angry, because I knew she was desperate like she had never been before. But now it didn't bring me any relief, it only ate me up even more from the inside. Every night I continued to drink in an attempt to drown out the voices in my head that now haunted me. I became addicted to this pain, to these dark thoughts, and it was starting to scare me. One night, sitting in an empty house with a bottle in my hand, I finally realized the truth: all these actions did not help me to free myself. On the contrary, I myself became a hostage to this hatred that I had created. I thought that by destroying it, I could get my life back, but now I realized that I had become different. In the pursuit of revenge, I lost everything that once made me myself. It wasn't a victory, it was a complete defeat, and I finally realized it. One morning, after another sleepless night, I felt that I had reached the limit. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a person I no longer recognized, emaciated, nervous, devastated. I realized that I needed to change something, otherwise this path would lead me to self-destruction. Gathering my strength, I took my phone and deleted all the records, all the evidence, all the photos. It was hard, but I realized that now the only way to find peace was to leave the past behind. I turned off my phone and left it at home, going out without any plan. I needed to be alone to figure out how to move on. Deep down, I knew I couldn't go back to my old life, but now I had a new goal: to find my way back to myself, to heal from the pain I had caused myself. Although it seemed almost impossible, I felt that it was the only way to get out of this circle of darkness. A few days passed after I deleted all the recordings, photos, and evidence. Surprisingly, the decision to leave the past behind caused neither regret nor doubt. On the contrary, I felt a strange calmness, as if a great burden had disappeared from my shoulders. But at the same time, when I was left alone with myself, I realized that I still had a long way to go to find my inner balance and believe in myself again. During this period, a book accidentally fell into my hands, which I initially perceived with distrust. It was a step-by-step plan for people who had experienced betrayal, and the book promised to help them find strength, get back on their feet, and start a new life in 30 days. The title was very encouraging, although deep down I doubted that any book could help me forget about everything I had been through. However, something about it caught my attention. Perhaps it was the fact that I already felt the need to change. The first chapter of the book was about accepting yourself and your emotions. The author insisted that the first step to healing is to understand and acknowledge your pain, not to fight it. I realized that all this time I had been trying to drown out the pain with revenge, anger, and alcohol, but I had not allowed myself to simply be hurt without resorting to destructive actions. I took a piece of paper and started writing down everything I was feeling, from pain to shame, from anger to loneliness. I was surprised that once I put my thoughts down on paper, they no longer seemed so overwhelming. The next day I continued reading. The book talked about the importance of forgiveness, not for the other person, but for yourself. It meant letting go of the pain and stopping replaying the moments of betrayal in my head. Forgive Alice? It seemed unbelievable. But the author emphasized that this is an important step for liberation. I sat for a long time thinking about whether I was ready for it, and eventually realized that this apology was not for her, but for me. Over the next few days, I followed the advice in the book. It suggested establishing new habits to help replace the old ones. The author suggested physical activity because it helps to get rid of anger and promotes recovery. I decided to give it a try. Every morning I went for a run, even if I didn't have the energy, and over time I felt my emotions gradually begin to stabilize. Each step made me feel like I was no longer running away from myself, but moving forward. Over time, the book led me to reflect on my values, on what was really important in life. It encouraged me to reconsider my goals and dreams, which I had neglected because of my focus on revenge. I started writing down what I really wanted to achieve, how I saw my future, and it gave me a new direction. I didn't want to look back anymore because I realized that by choosing that path, I was only continuing to hurt myself. One day, I decided to meet with Alice and finally take stock. She had been asking for this meeting for a long time, trying to justify her actions, but now I was ready for it, not because of the need to learn something new or to clarify the relationship, but to say goodbye and dot the I's and cross the T's. I felt that this meeting would help me to end this difficult period and give myself permission for a new beginning. When I arrived at the cafe where we had agreed to meet, I felt a strange calmness. Alice was waiting for me, looking tense, her eyes a little teary. In the past, this might have made me feel sorry or irritated, but now I looked at her without the emotions that had been driving me lately. "Hi, Alex," she said quietly, trying to find at least some reaction in my eyes. "Hi, Alice," I replied calmly, sitting down across from her. We were silent for a few minutes, and she finally spoke first. "I know what I did was terrible. I'm sorry for all of it, and I realize that you probably won't be able to forgive me," she said, barely holding back her tears. I felt a mixture of pain and compassion rising inside me, but at the same time I realized that it didn't matter anymore. She had made her choice, and now we both just had to live with it. But what really surprised me was that I no longer felt the need to hold on to that pain. All her words no longer had the same power as before. I sighed and looked at Alice with a certain warmth that surprised even me. All the time I thought that this conversation would end in conflict, but now I realized that I no longer felt any anger or the need to bring her out on emotion. On the contrary, I was ready to just put it all behind me, regardless of her remorse or excuses. "You know, Alice," I finally said, "the pain you've caused me has taught me a lot of things. But I also realized that revenge will not bring me peace. For a long time, I tried to hurt you as much as you hurt me, but in the end I realized that it would not help me recover. Now I just want to move on." Alice looked confused, as if she hadn't expected to hear me say that. Perhaps she was preparing for another outburst of emotion, or perhaps she wanted to hear more questions or accusations from me. But I didn't feel the need to continue this cycle of pain. "I know I've caused you a lot of suffering," she whispered, looking at me with remorse. "If there is any way to make it right." I just shook my head. "It doesn't matter anymore. Now I realize that I can only find peace when I let go of everything that happened. Perhaps we are both to blame for what happened, but now it is in the past. The main thing is not to repeat these mistakes in the future." I did not expect these words, but they came out of me with incredible ease. It seemed that all these months of hatred that had been accumulating inside me had finally found a way out, not through revenge, but through forgiveness. I felt free. We exchanged a few more words that no longer had much meaning. Alice nodded goodbye, and I left the cafe, slightly surprised by my reaction, but also with a sense of relief that I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew that this conversation was an important step that would help me to finally end this painful stage of my life. That evening, I returned home and picked up the very book that seemed to change my approach to the situation. In the last pages, the author talked about the importance of new beginnings, that true recovery comes when we choose to focus on our own future, not on the mistakes of others. He advised me to find new goals, new meanings that would allow me to regain my self-confidence. I decided to follow this advice. Over the next few weeks, I returned to the things that once brought me joy: traveling, new hobbies, sports. I started to meet new people, participated in interesting events, and gradually felt myself slowly but surely coming back to life. My anger disappeared, and in its place appeared a new desire to develop and be better than before. At one of the events, I met a woman with whom I struck up a light, unobtrusive conversation. It was a simple conversation about traveling and hobbies, but I suddenly felt that my heart was no longer burdened by the pain of the past. I realized that I was ready for a new beginning, that those dark pages of my life were behind me. She smiled, and I returned the smile, feeling calm and confidence regain their place in my life. That evening, when I returned home, I opened the window and breathed in the fresh air with a sense of freedom that I had seemed to have lost long ago. I realized that my life was not over yet and that, despite all the difficulties, there were still many wonderful things ahead of me. I may never see Alice again, and I may never return to that pain. I had completed my journey of revenge and recovery, and now, as I said goodbye to the past, I was ready for the future. I was no longer the same person who lived in darkness and pain. I was stronger, wiser, and ready for a new, real life. Thank you for going through this journey with me. I hope you found it interesting to share my experiences. If so, please leave a comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more exciting stories. Please excuse any pronunciation mistakes as the story is narrated by artificial intelligence. I am working on improving the quality of the content for you. See you soon.